Hi, everyone. My name is Anthony Ayers. I'm a first year PhD student in the Rehan Lab here at York University. And today I'm going to be presenting on my master's work examining urbanization effects on wallaby communities and their plant interactions. If cyberbullying is your thing, I have my email and social media in the corner. So to get started, urbanization is defined as landscapes that are dramatically altered and are pervasively built up areas with streets, sidewalks, buildings, anything that kind of removes the pervious ground cover that bees need to nest in. And it's also characterized, oh, this one? Okay. It's also characterized by high human population density. And these landscapes are growing and expanding through urban expansion and densification. And this is to accommodate for a growing global population that's projected to reach nearly 9 billion by the year 2050. And so these landscapes significantly influence the habitat that is necessary for bees to survive in these landscapes. So it reduces these landscape habitats, degrades them, fragments them, and contributes to a warming of the local environment compared to the surrounding environment, which is known as the urban heat island effect. So this results in a decline in not just bees, but a variety of taxa, including other insects, birds, reptiles, and some mammals as well. And the effects of urbanization on its bee communities within cities is dependent on its landscape and local factors that are found throughout them. And its landscape factors are those that are pervasive throughout the entire city, and local ones are more patch specific. And these factors can often interact with one another in interesting ways, and such that cities are kind of idiosyncratic in the ways that they can affect their different communities. So you can have a kind of generalized trend of how cities are affecting biodiversity, but each individual city can have its own unique effect on biodiversity, depending on how these landscape and local factors are interacting with one another within that particular city. And so a city like Lynchburg, Virginia, where I'm from in Toronto, can have completely different bee communities despite the geographical difference. And so the general trend we find throughout the literature with regard to how cities are affecting bees is that you have this filtering effect occurring primarily regarding functional traits in bees. And these are life history strategies that these bees are utilizing to survive in these spaces. And so you can think of more naturalized areas having kind of a diversity of these functional traits. You have specialists, generalists, ground nesters, and cavity nesters alike. However, within cities, you find this filtering effect. So what happens is you have a homogenization of these communities by these functional traits. So you lose some of these more vulnerable functional traits, such as your specialist and your ground nesting bees within these city spaces. Regardless of this homogenization of the communities by functional trait, you can still sometimes observe a great biodiversity of bees within cities. And some studies have indicated that there have been instances of cities having higher richness and abundance compared to agricultural landscapes. And so the aims of this particular study were to examine how the urban landscape was affecting bees within Toronto specifically, and then to examine how that is also affecting the plant interactions those bees are having within the city, primarily along a gradient of urbanization. And so the study region focused on the southwestern portion of the city and comprised about 30 sites, 10 of high, medium, and low urban intensity. And this was determined by the percentage of impervious surface surrounding site locations within a 250 diameter radius. And we monitored these locations biweekly from early spring to early fall using passive and active sampling methods. Passive methods consisted of pan trapping and blue vein traps, and active sampling consisted of netting and vacuuming. And the specimens collected from this active sampling were what were used for our plant pollinator networks. And then all of our bees that were collected were processed and identified as species. And for all these bees, we recorded the functional traits for these groups. So origin, behavior, lecti, nesting were the ones we focused on. And for our plant pollinator networks, we looked at community level indices, such as connectance, weighted nestedness, robustness, and interaction evenness, and individual level indices for the connection or for the network level indices. We looked at connectance for the proportion of interactions occurring throughout each of our urban gradients or intensities, robustness for resilience to the loss of species within the network, and weighted nestedness and interaction evenness for resource overlap within these urban spaces. And then for our individual indices. We looked pretty much at degree and normalized degree for the number of interactions each of our species are having in these spaces, and pollinator service index, which is a way of gauging pollinator support in a community. So overall, our sampling effort throughout the city, each for our particular 3 urban categories that we had, high, medium, and low, some have still yet to plateau, such as our high urban intensity. So that suggests that there could be some more sampling that we could be doing in these spaces. But overall, for the entire study region, we have a pretty representative representation of the bees that we observe here in Toronto, which is a little over 350 species here in the city. And then for the actual specimens that we collected about 5,500 bees comprising 26 genera and 164 species, with the most common species belonging to the Apidae and Halictidae families, and unsurprisingly being bees that a lot of people are familiar with, such as the honeybee, some bumblebee species, and sweat bees. For each of our urban categories that we have, we found that the medium urban category had the highest richness and abundance of bees, and the high urban category had the lowest abundance and richness of bees. Despite this was not a significant difference. And then for our functional traits, we noticed that some functional traits were significantly more abundant in these urban spaces compared to others, but these functional trait abundance and richness values were not significantly different across urban categories. So throughout the entire study region, we had an abundance of eusocial and solitary bees, native species, generalist species, ground nesting species, and apid and halictid species. And again, this was the same for abundance as well. For the landscape influence on bees, we looked at a couple of variables. So the percent of ground cover, tree cover, impervious surface, and shrub cover and grass cover. None of those variables were correlated with any of our functional trait categories that we looked at, or even our richness and abundance in bees, but except for subsocial richness. So subsocial richness was negatively correlated with impervious surface, while tree cover was slightly positively correlated. And then we also did NMDS analyses on the communities to see if these variables are just affecting the communities overall, and these same 2 variables are significantly influencing these 2 or these communities as well. The one variable that we found to significantly affect abundance and richness, though, was plant richness, which there was a lot of in this particular study with 180 genera. And then for our plant pollinator networks, we observed about 1,200 unique interactions out of about 3,000 total interactions between 145 bee species and 182 plant genera. For our network indices such as connectins, plant robustness, and interaction evenness, we found the high urban category had the highest values, and our low urban category had the highest weighted nestedness and robustness. And this is what the overall network for the entire city looks like, with interactions more than 10, but it's still kind of hard to see. For the bees within these networks, we found that the most abundant bees were generally the ones with the highest degree and normalized degree. So we have Apis mellifera, really the same players as we saw earlier. So your sweat bees, Serotina, and Bombus. And then for the plant side of things, we found that the plants that were being visited by the most species were goldenrod, chive, dandelion, garlic mustard, and your black and brown-eyed Susans. And so what does this mean for bees in cities, or in particular for Toronto? And so there's a number of studies that have indicated that bees are negatively influencing bees, but this is not particularly the case within Toronto. This doesn't mean that cities aren't affecting bees within the cities, because there are certain urban variables such as tree cover and impervious surface that are affecting specific functional traits such as subsocial richness. And then there are other aspects such as plant richness that are potentially shielding bees from the other perhaps egregious effects cities could be having on bees within these spaces. We found some expected trends that are concurrent within the literature, such as the presence of many generalist bees and several halictid and apid species, such as your honeybees and agapostemon. But we also found some unexpected trends for cities. So normally in cities, you find an abundance of cavity nesting bees as bare ground covers replaced with impervious surface, such as your sidewalk and roads and buildings. But in this particular case, we found that ground nesting bees were significantly more abundant, regardless of the urban category that we looked at, which was interesting to me. And then for our plant pollinator networks, we found that resource overlap was higher in some rural contexts that this has been applied in, but not as broad as in some urban areas. Connectance was relatively low overall, but robustness is high, particularly for plants, which a lot of them are non-native in cities. And then robustness is highest, or robustness in the highest intensity could indicate bee sensitivity because it was the lowest in that particular urban category. Yeah, no problem. So I'll just skip here to the end. So what could be interesting about Toronto in particular, because we did see some interesting things here. So some things that could be affecting it is pesticide usage is greatly restricted in Toronto through the passage of legislature that started in 2003 and has been expanded. And then we have some nonprofit and government support that is aimed at particularly promoting pollinators within urban areas. And these two factors could be particularly beneficial for these sensitive bees, such as those general or ground nesting species that we typically don't expect to find as many of in these urban spaces. And so the benefit for bees in this kind of work, I know a lot of research is done within agricultural context and primarily on honeybees, but urban agriculture still exists and is important for a lot of nutrients that people rely on. And a lot of these crops depend on our native species, but this work is also important for community outreach and not just bee well-being, but human health and well-being as well, and informing city policies, particularly within Toronto and specific cities where you can have some nuanced kind of results. So with that, thank you for listening. I know it's a little long, and I probably don't have any time for questions. So